Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're getting into something really fundamental.
Yeah, we're looking at how a country's political system, whether it's a democracy or more authoritarian, really shapes its military,
Yeah.
like right down to the structure.
Exactly. And specifically, this tightrope walk leaders face. How do you build a military strong enough for defense, strong enough to keep order?
But not so strong. It turns around and threatens your own power.
Precisely. And that tension, that guardianship dilemma, as it's called.
Well, it gets really intense in authoritarian regimes, doesn't it? They often don't have that same kind of built-in legitimacy you find in democracies.
Which means they focus heavily on coup-proofing, designing the military basically to stop coups.
Right, and sometimes, maybe often, that comes at a cost. It can actually make the military less effective against, outside threats.
It's a fascinating trade-off. We've got some great source material here looking at exactly these differences, authoritarian versus democratic military setups.
And how those differences connect to the risk of rebellion.
So our mission for you, the learner, is to really get under the hood of this. How political systems stamped their mark on military design. Why authoritarian leaders are, frankly, obsessed with preventing coups.
Even using methods that seem, counterproductive militarily.
And what it all means for how strong a nation's military actually is and how stable the country is. We're going to focus on 4 key ideas that came up in the research.
Okay, first, this idea that democracies are maybe freer to concentrate military power, whereas authoritarian regimes deliberately split it up, overlap commands, that sort of thing, to avoid being overthrown.
Second, we'll look at cases like Hitler and Stalin, how they kept multiple competing military groups going, like the SS and Wehrmacht, or the NKVD and Red Army, even during massive wars. No single unified command.
Third, the democratic side. Do their political and cultural foundations inherently make military rebellion less likely? Less anxiety about concentrating military power?
And finally, does all this mean democratic militaries end up with more flexible, maybe more efficient command structures for fighting wars?
While authoritarian ones get stuck with structures that are really about protecting the regime first, and maybe strategic sense second.
Right. So let's dive in. Let's start with the authoritarian playbook. How does this coup-proofing actually look in practice?
Well, think about it from the leader's perspective.
Yeah.
You're an authoritarian leader, you need the military. For survival. Against enemies outside, sure, but also against your own population sometimes.
But that same military, the guys with the guns and organization, they're also your biggest internal threat.
Exactly. That's the core of the guardianship dilemma for them. Because they lack that democratic legitimacy, that popular mandate. Swillick's work points this out. Leaders might empower the military when they feel threatened by the people.
Only to then try and weaken it or divide it when that threat fades, because now they're worried about a coup from the military itself.
It's this constant balancing act. High stakes.
So what are the concrete strategies they use? How do they actually try to coup-proof their forces? Quinlivan's research gives us a good framework here, right?
Yes, looking particularly at the Middle East, but you see these patterns elsewhere too. The main goal is just making it incredibly difficult, incredibly risky for anyone in the military to even think about staging a coup.
Building in distrust, essentially.
Deep distrust. A key tactic is playing on loyalties, personal loyalties.
How so?
Appointing people you trust implicitly to the top jobs. People from your family, your ethnic group, your tribe, maybe your religious community. Building a core group whose loyalty is personal to you, not necessarily to the military as an institution.
So it's less about finding the best general and more about finding the most loyal cousin or ally.
Often, yes.
Yeah.
Loyalty can trump competence, especially in key spots. Then there's the creation of parallel military forces. This is a classic one.
Like presidential guards, party militias.
Exactly. Armed groups completely separate from the regular Army's chain of command. They often get the better kit, better pay.
And they report directly to the leader.
Directly. They act as a counterweight. If the Army looks shaky, you've got this other loyal force ready to step in.
That sounds incredibly inefficient from a purely military perspective. Imagine coordinating those different forces in a war.
Oh, it can be a nightmare. Logistically, strategically. But from the leader's viewpoint, that friction, that rivalry between forces, that's not a bug. It's a feature. It keeps everyone divided.
And they don't stop there, do they? Multiple security agencies, too.
Absolutely. Setting up several intelligence and security services, often with overlapping jobs, all spying on the military, on the population, and crucially, on each other.
All reporting back to the leaders separately.
Right. It creates this pervasive atmosphere of surveillance. Makes it incredibly hard for plotters to coordinate without someone finding out. It breeds paranoia, which is exactly the point.
It's a pretty cynical way to hold on to power.
It is, and here's something slightly counterintuitive. Limiting professionalization.
What do you mean? Don't they want a skilled army?
They want technical skills, yes.
Yeah.
Soldiers need to know how to use the equipment. But true professionalization, where merit is the main driver, where there's a strong institutional identity, that can be seen as dangerous.
Why?
Because a highly professional officer corps might be more aware of the regime's weaknesses, more confident in its own abilities, maybe more likely to act if things go wrong, especially against parallel forces that might be more loyal but less, well, professional. So again, in key roles, loyalty often wins out over pure ability.
Wow. So potentially sacrificing battlefield competence just to feel safer from your own generals?
National security against external threats often takes a backseat to regime security against internal ones. It's a clear hierarchy of needs for these leaders.
And they use money, too, presumably, to buy that loyalty.
Definitely. Channeling lots of resources, better salaries, perks, fancy equipment, specifically to those key units and security agencies they rely on most. It gives those groups a strong vested interest in keeping the current regime in power.
It's like building multiple layers of internal defense, even if it weakens the whole structure against outside attack.
That's a good way to put it. And there are other tactics, too, constantly rotating commanders so they can't build up a power base, carrying out purges to remove anyone potentially disloyal, keeping tight central control over things like fuel and ammunition, so no unit can move without permission.
So the military ends up being designed as much, maybe even more, for internal political control as it is for national defense. Let's make this concrete. Nazi Germany, the Wehrmacht, and the SS. That seems like a classic example.
It really is. The SS started small, Hitler's bodyguard, right?
Yeah.
But it grew into this massive organization, part political police, part ideological elite, and critically, with its own combat arm, the Waffen-SS.
A completely separate military force.
Independent of the Wehrmacht, the traditional army. And it provided Hitler with this ideologically committed, fiercely loyal armed force he could trust implicitly.
And the loyalty within the SS was extreme, wasn't it? Directly to Hitler, to Nazi ideology.
Fanatically so, in many cases. They saw themselves as this racial, political elite. Very different from the Wehrmacht's more traditional military culture, although the Wehrmacht itself became heavily Nazified over time, of course.
And Hitler deliberately kept them separate, didn't integrate command.
Deliberately. He fostered competition, even rivalry, between the Wehrmacht and the SS. He made himself the final decider, the one they both answered to. This division served his goal perfectly, preventing any single military power bloc from emerging that could challenge him.
But did that division hurt them on the battlefield? The SS had a reputation for ferocity, but was the overall structure efficient?
Well, the Waffen-SS certainly could be effective tactically, ferocious fighters. But that divided command, the ideological priorities overriding military logic sometimes. Yes, it could lead to strategic problems, operational inefficiencies, resources not being used optimally.
It's complicated, though, because the German military was incredibly effective for a long time.
It was. And Talmadge actually points to Nazi Germany as a bit of a puzzle for coup-proofing theory. Hitler avoided a coup and ran a highly effective military, at least for several years. It suggests the relationship isn't always simple. Maybe it depends on the specific leader or regime type.
Interesting nuance. Okay, what about Stalin's Soviet Union, the NKVD alongside the Red Army?
Another classic example. The NKVD wasn't just secret police. It was huge. Ran the gulags, border guards, but also had its own large contingent of combat troops. Well-armed troops.
Doing what, mainly? Internal security?
Internal security, yes. Guarding borders, maintaining order in the rear during wartime, but also, infamously, operating blocking detachments behind Red Army lines.
To stop retreats, you mean shoot their own soldiers?
If necessary, yes.
Mm-hmm.
It shows their role in enforcing political discipline within the army itself. Their loyalty was to Stalin and the party, first and foremost.
And Stalin's regime was built on paranoia, the purges.
Extreme paranoia. The Great Purge in the late 1930s absolutely devastated the Red Army's experienced officer corps. Thousands were executed or imprisoned. Loyalty to Stalin became the only thing that mattered. Competence, experience, secondary. Belkin and chauffeur Powell, they detailed just how damaging this was.
Just before World War II.
Terrible timing. It directly contributed to the Red Army's catastrophic failures when the Nazis invaded in 1941. They'd eliminated so much of their skilled leadership in the name of regime security.
So the NKVD maintained internal control,
Ruthlessly effective at that.
but the cost was crippling the army's ability to fight an external enemy.
Exactly. The separate roles, the purges, it was all designed to prevent any unified military challenge to Stalin. Regime security was paramount, even if it demonstrably weakened national defense.
It's a recurring theme. Let's jump forward. Ba'athist Iraq under Saddam Hussein. This feels like coup-proofing taken to its absolute extreme.
It really was a textbook case. Saddam built his power on multiple layers of coup-proofing. He relied heavily on parallel elite forces, the Republican Guard, and later the even more elite Special Republican Guard.
Better gear, better pay, staffed by
People considered exceptionally loyal, often from his own Abu Nasser tribe or the Tikrit region, loyalty based on family, tribe, sect. Very personal.
Almost like a palace guard protecting him personally.
Very much so. And alongside that, a massive network of competing intelligence agencies, constant surveillance of the military, of society, frequent brutal purges of anyone suspected of disloyalty or even just ambition. It created this intense climate of fear.
Paula called this palace guardism and commissarism, right?
Yes, and he argues persuasively that these measures absolutely wrecked the Iraqi military's combat effectiveness. Promotions were based purely on loyalty, leading to incompetent leaders at every level.
So officers were afraid to act.
Terrified of initiative. They'd stick rigidly to plans even when they were clearly failing, because deviating was too risky personally. You saw the results starkly in the Iran-Iraq War, the 1991 Gulf War, the 2003 invasion, often outnumbered, sometimes outgunned, but consistently outfought because their command structure was so dysfunctional.
The obsession with internal security made them incredibly brittle against external force. What about Syria under Hafez al-Assad? Similar patterns.
Very similar, yes. Assad, being from the Alawi minority, stacked the key military and security posts with fellow Alawis, especially from his own tribe and family. Sunnis might get some visible positions, but the real power, the deep state, was Alawi-dominated.
And parallel forces again,
Yeah.
competing agencies.
Yes, he created units like the defense brigades under his brother Rifat, and multiple intelligence agencies, Air Force intelligence, military intelligence, deliberately designed to watch each other as much as any external enemy, prevent any one group getting too strong.
It's that same logic of division and distrust.
Exactly. He even used informal social quotas within units, mixing identities to create internal friction, making it harder for soldiers to unite and organize from below.
Effective for keeping power, presumably.
Very effective for regime stability for decades, but almost certainly at the cost of conventional military efficiency. Prioritizing loyalty and sect over competence, fragmenting command that creates problems in a major war.
Although you mentioned the Syrian army showed some resilience, like in 1973.
They did. It shows the impact isn't always total or immediate. Other factors matter too: training, equipment, the specific enemy. But the underlying structural weaknesses caused by coup-proofing were likely still there, constraining them.
So across these examples, Germany, USSR, Iraq, Syria, we see these recurring, deliberate strategies aimed squarely at regime survival. What are the overall effects? How does this actually change the way these militaries operate?
The effects are pretty consistent and mostly negative for military effectiveness. First, you get leadership problems. Promoting based on loyalty, not skill, means you often have incompetent people in charge. More strategic mistakes, more failures on the battlefield.
And the fear factor.
Huge impact. That climate of fear and surveillance kills initiative. Officers become afraid to take risks, afraid to adapt. They just follow orders, even bad ones. Flexibility goes out the window.
And the parallel units, the divided command.
That undermines coordination. Different units don't trust each other, don't share information or resources effectively. Joint operations become a mess. The best gear and people often go to the loyalist Praetorian Guard units, not necessarily where they're needed most for national defense.
Training probably suffers too.
Often, yes.
Yeah.
Time spent on political indoctrination or internal security duties is time not spent on realistic combat training for fighting external enemies.
So you might see impressive parades, big armies.
But underneath, there could be serious structural weaknesses that only show up under the stress of actual combat.
It's a paradox, isn't it? Steps taken to make the regime more secure internally actually make the state less secure externally.
Exactly. It can become a vicious cycle. Military failures make the leader even more paranoid, leading to more intense coup-proofing, which weakens the military further. It's a trap.
And you mentioned not all strategies are equally bad.
Right. Maybe bribing units or using propaganda causes less direct damage to fighting ability than, say, systematically promoting loyal incompetence or deliberately fragmenting your command structure. Leaders make choices based on how insecure they feel. The most insecure leaders often pick the methods that feel safest for them, even if they're the most damaging militarily.
That's a crucial point. The leader's psychology matters. Okay, we have a table summarizing these strategies and impacts across the cases we discussed. It really drives home the common patterns. Now, let's flip the coin. How do democratic states approach this? How do they structure their militaries?
Well, the whole philosophy is different. It starts with the idea of clear civilian control over a professional, politically neutral military. Huntington's concept of objective civilian control is key here. Meaning you maximize military professionalism, make the military an expert tool for managing violence, subordinate it to civilian leaders, but keep it out of politics. Make it politically sterile. He contrasted that with subjective control, where civilians try to politicize the military, which he saw as dangerous.
So, a professional, apolitical military is more likely to accept civilian leadership.
That's the core idea. And Fever talks about the civil-military problematique. How do you make the military strong enough to protect you, but not so strong it threatens you? Democracies address this mainly through a principal-agent relationship.
Civilian leaders are the principals, the military, the agents.
Exactly. The military obeys legitimate civilian authority. But Fever notes there's always that tension-balancing readiness with minimizing any risk of the military overstepping its bounds.
So instead of the harsh coup-proofing we saw in autocracies, democracies use different safeguards. More institutional.
Right. Things like strong legislative oversight, Congress or Parliament controlling the money, confirming appointments, holding hearings, declaring war. The rule of law is fundamental. Military people are subject to law like everyone else.
Civilian leadership at the top, too.
Clear civilian leadership in defense ministries, accountable to elected bodies. And maybe just as important, cultural norms. A society that expects civilian control and a military profession that internalizes that norm.
And just having strong democratic institutions matters.
Hugely. Mature, stable democracies with a history of civilian rule are just much less prone to coups in the first place. It's a whole system of checks and balances, formal and informal.
Let's look at specifics again. The United States, how does it work there?
The U.S. Constitution sets it up clearly. President is commander-in-chief. But Congress has the power of the purse, the power to declare war. Separation of powers right there.
And the Department of Defense.
Headed by a civilian Secretary of Defense. The service secretaries, Army, Navy, Air Force, also civilians. The operational command chain runs from the president through the SecDef to the combatant commanders.
What about the top general, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs?
Crucially, the chairman is the principal military advisor, but not in the operational chain of command. That prevents too much power being concentrated in one military figure. Plus, you have constant, powerful oversight from congressional committees and rules limiting political activity for active duty personnel.
So layers of civilian control and oversight woven into the fabric of the system, the UK. Similar principles.
Similar principles, different structure, obviously. Constitutional monarchy, parliamentary sovereignty. The Prime Minister and the Secretary of State for Defense hold the real power accountable to Parliament.
Civilian Defense Secretary.
Yes, heading the Ministry of Defense, working alongside the top military officer, the Chief of the Defense Staff, who advises but doesn't command operations directly in that sense. Again, strong parliamentary committees scrutinize everything, while some studies point out issues, like in the military justice system sometimes.
The underlying principle of civilian oversight is strong.
Very strong. And the military's own stated values emphasize things like lawful conduct, fitting into that professional subordinate ethos.
Okay. And France, with its strong presidential role.
The president does have significant power over the armed forces, especially defense policy and nuclear forces. But the government, the prime minister and minister of the armed forces, executes policy and answers to Parliament.
Civilian minister again?
Yes, though the balance of influence within the ministry between civilians and military figures has shifted over time. Parliament has oversight powers, though maybe less consistently exercised than in the U.S. or U.K. sometimes. France also has the gendarmerie, which is interesting.
Military police, essentially.
Kind of. It's part of the armed forces, but does civilian policing under the Interior Ministry mostly. It blows the lines a bit,
Right.
but it operates under clear civilian ministerial control. It's not really a parallel force in the coup-proofing sense.
So, across these democracies, the approach isn't about dividing the military against itself out of fear, but about embedding civilian control through institutions, laws, and norms. How does that mitigate coup risk?
It's a combination. First, legitimacy. Elected governments have a mandate that military intervention inherently lacks in a democratic culture. That political culture itself views military intervention as wrong.
The professional ethos of the military, too.
Absolutely critical. An ethos of obeying civilian authority, respecting the Constitution, staying out of politics, swearing allegiance to the Constitution, not a person. Then you have strong civil society free press, active citizens, independent courts acting as watchdogs.
And functioning democratic institutions provide peaceful ways to change things.
Right. If you can vote the government out or challenge things in court, there's less justification or need for the military to step in. And democracies tend to integrate the military with society, fostering shared values, unlike autocracies that often isolate or control their military through fear and favor.
So it's the whole package, the institutions, the culture, the professionalism that provides stability.
Exactly. It's the hardware of institutions and the software of norms and culture working together. This allows democracies to focus military organization more rationally on external threats, built on trust and professionalism, not fear. But it's not perfect or static. Maintaining that balance is an ongoing process.
Okay, so let's compare directly now. Authoritarian versus democratic. Command and control, you said democracies centralize for efficiency, autocracies fragment out of fear.
Broadly, yes. Democracies establish clear civilian supremacy over the military, but the military's internal command structure is usually designed for operational effectiveness. That might mean integrated hierarchical command, like the U.S. unified commands. The goal is fighting effectively under civilian direction.
Whereas autocracy...
Often deliberately fragment command. Parallel forces, multiple intelligence agencies watching the army, commanders chosen for loyalty first. The main goal is preventing a coup, even if it means undermining unity of command, a key principle for military effectiveness.
And those parallel organizations, the SS, Republican Guard, are they almost exclusively an authoritarian thing?
Pretty much a hallmark of authoritarian coup-proofing, designed as loyal counterweights. Democracies don't really do that. Gendarmeries in France or Italy are different. They're primarily law enforcement under civilian control, not regime protection forces aimed against the regular army. The purpose is totally different.
And managing rebellion risk. Autocracies use coercion and patronage. Democracies use institutions and norms.
That sums it up well. Autocracies rely on surveillance, purges, buying loyalty directed personally at the leader. Democracies rely on strong institutions, rule of law, a culture of civilian supremacy, a professional military loyal to the Constitution, and civil society oversight.
So, our third hypothesis that democracies have inherent political and cultural foundations deterring rebellion seems well supported.
I think so. Those foundations reduce the need for the kind of severe, direct coup-proofing you see elsewhere.
Which leads to the big question. Does this actually make democratic militaries better at fighting wars? More effective?
The evidence suggests, generally, yes. The authoritarian trade-offs, loyalty over competence, stifled initiative, fragmented command, misallocated resources, tend to degrade combat performance, especially in major conventional wars. Think of Iraq's repeated defeats, or the early Soviet struggles after the purges.
While democracies benefit from
Merit-based promotion, in principle, encouraging initiative within doctrine, integrated command, often higher morale and public support. Research does suggest democracies tend to win the wars they fight more often. Think of the U.S. Army adapting and overcoming the Wehrmacht in World War II.
But there are nuances, right? The Wehrmacht itself was highly effective for a long time.
Absolutely. It's not a simple equation. The Wehrmacht is a key counterexample or complexity. And the Soviet military during the Cold War had its own kind of effectiveness based on mass. Syrian resilience in '73. It's not black and white.
So what's the key difference then?
It's the systemic bias. Authoritarian systems are fundamentally biased towards prioritizing regime security, often sacrificing military effectiveness to do it. Democratic systems are biased towards accountability and professionalism, which generally supports effectiveness, but they have their own challenges too, political debates, budget fights, etc.
It sounds like authoritarian leaders, trying so hard to control everything, can lose control of the actual outcome on the battlefield.
That's a great way to put it. Micromanaging loyalty can undermine macro-level performance. Democratic systems based on trust and professionalism tend to be more resilient, more adaptable when things go wrong. Authoritarian militaries built on fear can be brittle. If the leader falters or the loyalist units break, the whole thing can collapse faster.
So, effectiveness isn't just about technology or numbers. It's deeply tied to the political system behind the military. We have another table here contrasting these principles, really highlighting the different paths they take.
Okay, so bringing it all together, revisiting those initial ideas, it seems pretty clear authoritarian regimes do lean towards dispersed command and parallel forces to stop coups. Nazi Germany, the USSR are prime examples, supporting hypotheses 1 and 2.
And democracies do seem to have structural, political, and cultural advantages that lower coup risk hypothesis 3.
Which in turn potentially allows them to build more flexible, efficient militaries focused on external threats. Hypothesis 4 seems plausible, though with those nuances we discussed about effectiveness.
It really highlights that core tension, doesn't it? Especially for authoritarian states, the trade-off between regime security and military effectiveness. Coup-proofing might keep you in power, but it can seriously damage your ability to fight a real war.
While democracies, though generally fostering more effective forces, are always navigating that delicate balance Fever described, keeping civilian control over a powerful, professional military. It's a universal problem, the civil-military problematique.
But they try to solve it differently. Autocracies use direct, often coercive methods aimed at the military. Democracies use broader institutional and normative frameworks to shape the military's role.
And those different solutions lead directly to the different structures, risks, and effectiveness levels we've been talking about.
And understanding this is vital for anyone looking at international relations today, right? Assessing military power means looking beyond the parades and the hardware.
Absolutely. You have to understand the internal structure, the loyalty dynamics, especially in authoritarian states. And for efforts promoting democracy, building professional militaries under firm civilian control is just critical.
It also comes down to how leaders see risk, doesn't it?
Completely. An authoritarian leader sees a coup as the existential threat, personally. Everything is geared towards preventing that. Democratic leaders, trusting their institutions more, can afford to focus military design more on external threats under civilian guidance. That different risk perception drives everything.
So here's something for you, the learner, to think about. How often do those seemingly rational steps a leader takes to secure their own power, dividing the army, playing factions off each other, actually end up weakening them strategically in the long run? Can you see modern examples of these kinds of power balancing acts? And what does all this tell us about the real strength of regimes that look powerful on the outside, but might be deeply insecure on the inside?
And if you want to dive deeper into these ideas, the bibliography in our show notes lists the key works we drew on scholars like Quinlivan, Svolek, Talmage, Pollock, Huntington, and others. Lots of fascinating reading there on this crucial link between politics and military power.